Gantz. It looks like a survival game, but it is really a story about what happens when human life is treated as disposable. Gantz began serialization in 2000, written and drawn by Hiroya Oku. It arrived at a moment when shonen manga still dominated the mainstream conversation, and its arrival was genuinely jarring. Most action manga of that era were built around friendship, growth, and earned victory. Gantz rejected all of that. It placed its protagonist, Kei Kurono, a selfish and socially detached teenager, into a system that had no interest in rewarding him for being better. That made it feel immediately different from almost everything else on shelves at the time. At the start, Kei dies in a subway accident and wakes up in a strange apartment alongside other recently dead people. A black sphere called Gantz greets them as if it has been waiting. That sphere assigns missions to hunt alien beings hidden in Tokyo, equips them with high-tech gear, and runs a point system that can eventually buy freedom, even resurrection for people they care about. That setup is the entry point, but the real disturbance is how fast the manga strips away any sense of comfort. The violence of early missions makes the stakes brutally clear. People are torn apart, overwhelmed, and destroyed in ways that feel clinical and immediate. Later arcs escalate into battles involving massive casualties, entire buildings collapsing, and near-omnipotent enemies who can erase groups of characters in seconds. One of the most devastating arcs leaves Kei facing a situation so extreme that his identity fractures completely under the pressure. What sets Gantz apart is how detached it feels even while showing extremes. That emotional distance makes the whole thing colder, not easier. The story is not just about monsters. It is about the way repeated terror flattens empathy and turns human beings into instruments. The system never rewards growth in a clean way. It rewards surviving long enough to enter the next cycle. Gantz does not let you pretend any of this is clean. It keeps showing how the machine grinds people down and how even the ones who survive are changed in ways that are not easy to live with. Domu. It begins in an ordinary housing complex, and that ordinary setting is exactly why it gets under your skin. Published in 1980 by Katsuhiro Otomo, Domu predates his landmark work Akira by 2 years. And in many ways, it is more disturbing precisely because of its scale. Akira is catastrophic and citywide. Domu is contained, almost claustrophobic, set entirely inside a public housing block in suburban Tokyo. That constraint is part of its power. Otomo was working in a manga landscape still largely defined by genre conventions, and Domu broke from those conventions by taking the very mundane and making it unbearable. It won the Seinen Award for Science Fiction in 1983, recognizing it as something genuinely new. The story begins with small disturbances in the apartment complex. Things move in strange ways. A child is found lying in a trance-like state. People feel watched in the corridors. An elderly resident named Old Cho, who appears harmless and senile, is at the center of it, using psychic abilities to manipulate and quietly destroy the lives of those around him. Then a young girl named Emi arrives with her family, and she has abilities of her own. The power at the center is not simply destructive, it is personal. Old Cho uses his abilities to indulge, to control, to make the world bend around his own impulses, and there is something deeply unsettling about the intimacy of that. Emi's conflict with him is not a battle between good and evil in a straightforward sense. It is a confrontation between two people who are too powerful for the ordinary world to contain. What makes Domu disturbing is how precise the violence becomes. Walls collapse, bodies are flung through concrete, and entire structures are reduced to rubble. Otomo draws destruction with mechanical clarity, and that makes every rupture feel final. The final confrontation tears the building apart in a way that is almost apocalyptic in miniature. The disturbance comes from the fact that all of this is rooted in a place that should be ordinary. Domu makes you feel like you're watching something fundamental break, and once it breaks, it does not go back. Uzumaki. It takes one of the simplest shapes imaginable and turns it into a source of dread. Junji Ito began serializing Uzumaki in 1998, and it represents the fullest expression of his ability to take an abstract concept and turn it into sustained horror. By the late 1990s, horror manga existed in a crowded space. Ito had already built a reputation with short-form work, but Uzumaki was his first major long-form story, and it showed how far that concept-first approach could go. It was not trying to compete with gore or action, it was doing something quieter and more insidious. The story is set in Kuruzu-cho, a small coastal town where a high school girl named Kiri watches the world around her slowly deteriorate. Her boyfriend's father becomes obsessed with spirals, spending hours drawing them, staring at them, collecting objects that contain them. Other townspeople follow. Snails gather in patterns, hair twists without explanation. The obsession spreads before anyone understands what it is. As the story continues, the spiral becomes more violent and more invasive. Bodies contort and twist. People become trapped in spiraling structures. One arc involves a hurricane that spirals inward and drags everything into a vortex. Another involves a body that collapses into itself, folding until it is almost nothing. The manga does not hesitate to show physical transformation in extreme detail, and that visual commitment is part of what makes it so effective. The characters cannot reason their way out of this. They face a pattern that keeps invading life at every level. Bodies, spaces, habits, and thoughts all begin to bend around the same force. That gives the manga its cosmic quality. The disturbance is bigger than fear. It is a loss of scale. The final chapters push Kuruzucho into a state of collapse that has no real resolution. Kiri and her father try to escape, but the town seems to resist like a living thing. The ending is not a victory, it is exhaustion. Uzumaki is frightening because it treats a shape like fate, and it makes the ordinary feel permanently contaminated. Goodnight, Punpun. It is disturbing in a quieter way because it does not need to raise its voice to leave a mark. Inyo Asano serialized Goodnight, Punpun from 2007 to 2013, and it arrived in a manga landscape that was rich in psychological and seinen work, but few titles were willing to go as far into unglamorous emotional territory as this one. Asano drew on influences from literary fiction and philosophy, including Nietzsche and existentialist thought, and filtered them through the lens of Japanese suburban life. The result was something that felt more like a slow, honest documentary of psychological collapse than a traditional manga narrative. It won the Eisner Award, which recognized it as a work of genuine literary quality. The story follows Punpun Onodera from childhood through early adulthood. His father is depressed, alcoholic, and prone to emotional cruelty. His mother abandons the family. His sister eventually disappears too. The household never stabilizes. Punpun is drawn not as a realistic human figure, but as a small, simple bird shape, while everyone around him is rendered with Asano's hyper-realistic style. That visual contrast creates an unsettling split that the manga never lets you forget. As the story moves forward, Punpun develops a deep and unhealthy obsession with a girl named Aiko, who is carrying her own significant damage. Their relationship is tender in moments and deeply destructive in others. Punpun keeps making choices that hurt both of them, and the manga holds him accountable for those choices without flinching. By the time the story enters its final act, he has reached a state of near total isolation, and the manga takes him through a breakdown that is difficult to read in the best possible way. What makes Goodnight Punpun disturbing is its patience. It understands that pain does not always arrive as a dramatic collapse. Sometimes it arrives as accumulation. A bad home, a small betrayal, an unspoken disappointment, and then another one, and then another. The manga tracks that layering with painful accuracy, and the result is not a single shocking moment, but a long emotional stain. The story is not trying to scare you with spectacle. It is trying to show how a person can drift into damage while still looking. From the outside, like they are just getting older. Parasyte. It is disturbing because it turns the body into a negotiation. Hitoshi Iwaki began serializing Parasyte in 1988, and it stands as one of the most forward-thinking manga of its era. Body horror existed in the genre before Iwaki, but he combined it with something unusual for the time, genuine philosophical inquiry. The manga landed in a period when science fiction manga was gaining serious traction, and Parasyte distinguished itself by treating its alien invasion premise not as an action spectacle, but as a meditation on what it means to be human. It won the Kodansha Manga Award in 1993 and influenced a generation of seinen writers. The story begins when alien creatures arrive on Earth and try to enter human bodies through the nose or ear. They take over the brain and use the body as a host. One of them, attempting to enter high school student Shinichi Izumi through his ear, is blocked and ends up in his right hand instead. Because it cannot reach his brain, it cannot take full control. They are forced to coexist. The Parasyte names itself Migi, and from that point on, Shinichi's body is a shared space between two minds. As the story continues, Shinichi begins to lose parts of his emotional range. He becomes more logical, more detached. He can no longer cry, no longer feel fear the way he used to. That is the real horror. It is not that he is being controlled, it is that he is changing in ways that make him feel less human. The parasites he encounters are not mindless either. They are efficient, curious, and capable of cold calculation, which makes them harder to dismiss emotionally. They are a reminder that survival looks very alien when stripped of familiar human feelings. Later arcs escalate into a large-scale conflict involving parasites who have infiltrated human society. Some running for political office, some operating schools as feeding grounds. Shinichi and Migi are forced into a kind of symbiosis that neither of them chose, and those moments of cooperation are always tinged with the knowledge that they are not fully one. The manga keeps circling its core question. What does it mean to live inside yourself if part of that self is no longer entirely yours? It never answers cleanly, and that is exactly where its power lies. Fire Punch. It is the most punishing of the group, but what makes it disturbing is not volume, it is endurance. Tatsuki Fujimoto, who would later become widely known for Chainsaw Man, serialized Fire Punch from 2016 to 2018. It was his first major long-form work, and it announced his sensibility immediately. The manga landscape in the mid-2010s was full of dark fantasy and post-apocalyptic stories, but Fire Punch was different in a specific way. It was not interested in power systems or tactical battles, it was interested in suffering as a sustained condition and in what happens to a person who cannot escape it. That made it immediately uncomfortable and immediately distinct. The story begins in a world covered in ice, where an entity called the Almighty provides the only warmth in an otherwise lethal environment. Communities are built around fire, and people have developed special abilities through generations of hardship. Agni is a young man living with his younger sister Nola, who is terminally ill. He uses his regeneration ability to provide food for his community, burning parts of himself to produce flesh that can be eaten. That is their baseline. It is already grim. The inciting event is devastating. Soldiers from a rival group set Agni on fire as a demonstration of power. Because of his regeneration ability, he does not die. He keeps burning, keeps regenerating, keeps feeling the pain in a loop that goes on for years. That is the condition that defines everything that follows. He is not cursed with death, he is cursed with survival. As the story continues, Agni is hunted, used, and feared by turns. He meets a man named Doma who set him ablaze and who carries his own warped ideology about suffering and meaning. He meets a woman named Togata who is fighting for her own reasons and whose relationship with Agni becomes one of the most complex and disturbing in the story. The relationships are intense and unstable. Trust is rare. Betrayal is constant. One of the most difficult arcs puts Agni in a situation where he is forced to confront the reality of what Nola meant to him, and what her loss cost him before the story even properly began. The final chapters push into territory that is almost cosmological, forcing Agni to face the nature of the Almighty and the meaning of his own existence in a world that was never designed for him to survive comfortably in. The ending is not comforting. It is more like a long exhale after something that could not go on. Fire Punch refuses to make suffering poetic in a clean way. It shows how trauma, revenge, and survival become tangled until none of them feels pure anymore. That is what makes it stay with you. It is not simply dark. It is emotionally contaminated in a very specific way, and it knows exactly what that contamination costs. Gantz, Domu, Uzumaki, Goodnight Punpun, Parasyte, and Fire Punch all disturb in different ways, but they share one core idea. They do not just show horror, they show what horror does to human structure. Gantz is mechanical and cold, turning life into a transaction across 40 years of manga history. Domu is intimate and explosive, bringing destruction into a place that should be safe. Uzumaki is conceptual and suffocating, turning a harmless pattern into a force that reshapes reality. Punpun is emotional and patient, showing how a person can slowly break under the weight of damage that never stops arriving. Parasyte is bodily and philosophical, questioning what it means to be human when the body itself is no longer yours. Fire Punch is relentless and corrosive, showing how endurance can become a curse when pain has no end. Together, they create a focused argument about what manga can do when it decides to be uncomfortable on purpose. Each one gets room to breathe. Each one pressures a different part of what it means to be human. That is why this list works. It is not just a collection of dark stories. It is a sustained exploration of how disturbance takes shape and how each shape leaves a mark that lasts long after the final page is turned.